Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever it happens to be in your time zone. In this first session, I'm going to talk about the philosophy of science issues that underlie case study methods, qualitative methods. I'm going to first address why it's important to have strong research methods. Then I'll say something about the short history of case study methods, focusing on the post-World War II era. I'll say something about the philosophy of science of causation, prediction, and explanation. That will lead into our first discussion exercise. Then in the second and third videos of this first segment, we'll talk about causal mechanisms and explanation, and then we'll talk about different ideas about how we judge theory choice or theory progress. So why are strong methods important? It's very easy to make mistakes in social science or other kinds of sciences when you're trying to understand the causes of outcomes or the causes of general phenomena. There's lots of ways that you can fall prey to confirmation bias, the psychology of confirmation bias, and that's true whether you're talking about using statistics or case studies or even with experiments where you're able to randomize between a treatment and a control group. Even in all of these settings, there are risks of inferential errors if you don't have strong methods. So if you don't have good methods, then that means you're wasting your time, and you may be wasting other people's time, and you may be coming to conclusions that have implications for policy that turn out not to be true. Just to give one recent example, some of the early studies in the US of coronavirus, the pandemic, were looking at whether there was a spread of the disease from so-called background cases, asymptomatic or other cases. But the problem was, at that time, early on in the pandemic in the United States, they only tested people who'd been to Wuhan. So by definition, you can't find asymptomatic and background spread of the disease if you're only testing people that you already knew who went to Wuhan. It's the people that they came in contact with who might be spreading the disease in the background. So if you're not testing those people they came in contact with, by definition, you're going to come up with zero background spread. And that's basically the conclusion that some policymakers came to, and it was the wrong conclusion, and they didn't act soon enough, and so we've ended up with a much more severe coronavirus outbreak than we would have had if they had thought more systematically and used some testing of asymptomatic people who come into contact with people who'd been to Wuhan or had otherwise been exposed to the disease. Okay, so recently scholars in a variety of different fields, political science, economics, psychology, have worried a lot more about research methods, and this is because they found that when they try to repeat previous research, whether it's experiments or other methods, often they're not able to achieve the same results. We call this the replication crisis. And it applies even to medical research and even to experiments, and a really high proportion of those studies can't be replicated. That doesn't mean necessarily they're wrong, because there are various reasons you can't repeat a study and get the same result. You can't access the same kind of sample of the population. Maybe things in the world have changed or whatever else. But it does raise some concerns, and we also know from looking at the methods of these studies that often they don't have a sufficiently large sample size to make strong claims, or that they tested out many different models before they found that one that was statistically significant. We call this p-hacking. And so these are forms of methods that can lead you into confirmation bias. So this is a concern, again, regardless of your method, whether it's case study methods or quantitative methods or experimental methods. So a lot of journals and a lot of scholars are responding to this problem by tightening up their methodological standards and expectations. Journals are sometimes requiring pre-registration of studies as a way of making it less likely that people will try a bunch of different theories or models to see which one just happens to fit, and various other procedures. There are reasons we'll talk about maybe later in the course about why pre-registration is not necessarily a good idea for qualitative studies, which are more iterative between theories and evidence. But there are a lot of changes in the way that we carry out our research as a result of this renewed concern about getting valid results. So let me say something about a short history of qualitative methods, especially since World War II. In some ways, qualitative case study methods have been around as long as people have been around. They go back to Thucydides, if you want, the famous historian, and they're kind of intuitive methods, but precisely because they seem kind of intuitive, sometimes our intuitions could lead us astray. So we want to use them more systematically. That's what this course is all about. In general, we often try to use strong research methods to prevent ourselves from falling into confirmation bias, whether we're using statistics or case studies or any other method. So initially, after World War II, there was lots of criticism of case study methods, that they were kind of atheoretical, they weren't very rigorous, they didn't accumulate, they didn't add up over time to increasingly strong or convincing results, and they were just sort of all over the place. A lot of them were just descriptive histories without much theory or thought behind them. As a result of that, partly the social sciences, political science in particular, started turning to other methods of analysis, statistical analysis in particular. And also at this time, computers were becoming more powerful. It was more possible to do statistical methods, although, as I've just mentioned, we're now gaining a renewed appreciation for some of the problems of just carrying out lots of regression analysis with lots of different models. You may get some results that look like they're something significant, but they're really just accidental correlations. So in the 60s and 70s, fewer and fewer articles in the top journals used case study methods, and more of them used statistics. I'll show you some data on that in just a minute. In the 1970s, 1980s, partly as a result of these developments, a number of scholars, my co-author Alex George, Harry Eckstein, David Collier, Jaworski and Toon, Theda Skocpol, many others, started to improve and systematize case study methods. In more recent years, the 1990s, myself and a lot of other scholars have tried to systematize even further case study methods and make them more clear and transparent and rigorous. I've listed some of these scholars here. There are many more as well now. And we've also developed new organizations to try to improve and disseminate good case study and qualitative research. And these include two in particular. The American Political Science Association has a section or division on qualitative and multi-method research that it got started about 10 years ago, and already it's the second largest of the 40 divisions in the American Political Science Association, and so it's a very active, very large section. And secondly, there's something called the Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research. It's a 2-week institute at Syracuse University every year. Colin Ellman is one of the chief organizers. I've helped organize that since the beginning. David Collier and some others have been involved in that effort as well. So we've improved the organizational component of advancing and training in qualitative methods as well. So I would say as a result of these developments, there's a new respect for case study methods. A lot more scholars are willing to include them in multi-method research designs, and others are doing them as the single or sole research design in any given particular project. I would also say that the proportion of articles in top journals in the social sciences that use case study methods has stabilized. Remember, I said it was dropping sharply in the 1960s and 1970s. I'll show you some data in just a second of how that's kind of leveled off now. So I would say now the social sciences, political science are much more open to a wide variety of methods. It's much more pluralistic than when I started out in my training at graduate school. Although different journals will specialize in work that uses particular methods. Let me show you some data on some of these issues here. In an early survey about 20 years ago with my graduate students, we just looked at the articles published in top journals in political science, and we just counted up how many use different methods. And here in this table, we can see what I mentioned earlier, that the proportion of articles, this is in the American Political Science Review, that's one of the top journals in American political science. And so we can see that the proportion of articles using case studies really plummeted from about 70% in the early 1960s to a very low percentage of the articles in that journal. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, statistics shot way up in terms of the number of articles published using those methods in this journal, and we see a big increase in formal modeling as well in the 1980s. If we look at a wider range of journals and focus more on the period since 1975, here we see that stabilization that I mentioned. Some people either hoped or feared that formal modeling and statistics would take over the entire field of political science. It has not. You can see here case studies are still a very healthy proportion of social science, or at least political science. That formal modeling is as well, and statistics is still a very highly used method of research. Here we see the great variation by journal. Remember that APSR journal that I showed you a few minutes ago? We can see that this is very much at the low end of using case studies, whereas some like Comparative Politics, Political Science Quarterly, World Politics, International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, and others, these publish a very high proportion of work using case studies. So some other recent trends here in political science in particular. DART is the Data Access and Research Transparency Initiative. This is an effort by a lot of scholars and institutions to increase the transparency of research, whether it's statistical research or case study research. Recently, there was a publication online that I was involved in that you can find pretty easily, which is the Qualitative Transparency Deliberations, QTD, where a number of qualitative scholars address the issue of what does research transparency mean for qualitative research. JETS is the Journal Editors Transparency Statements. This is a number of journal editors that have committed to publishing more clear standards of what kind of transparency they want in research. You can look to the statement in the front of the American Political Science Review for a good example of that kind of transparency statement. So this is part of that raising of standards and expectations that I mentioned. I would say there's also renewed interest in experiments, natural experiments, although we also have renewed appreciation for the limitations of those methods that have come with this concern over the replication crisis. There's growing interest in machine learning or artificial intelligence. There's growing interest in computer-assisted content analysis and agent-based modeling, which is a kind of a formal model. There's a lot of interest in multi-method work. My colleague at Georgetown, Diana Kapachevsky, is doing a survey now with her graduate students, similar to the one I just showed you the data from, that she's going to focus specifically on multi-method work, see which kinds of methods people are combining, whether the use of multi-method work is increasing or not, whether it's stable, what proportion of the published articles use multi-method work. So I think that'll be an interesting study when it's ready and when it comes out. But let me focus here on some recent developments in case study methods. So case studies are often aimed at causal explanation of the outcomes of individual cases, and so that often involves what we call within-case analysis or process tracing, but it's often used together with cross-case comparisons. We'll talk a lot about different kinds of case selection and case comparison strategies here. I'm just giving you an overview in this first session. So as I mentioned, the most common form of within-case analysis is process tracing. We'll say a lot about that. It's a lot like detective work to figure out how to explain the outcome in a particular case. And recently, I've been doing some work, Tasha Fairfield, Andrew Charman, some others have been doing some work on what we call Bayesian process tracing, which is using Bayesian logic. It's a mathematical kind of logic to be more transparent about how we assess the weight of evidence for alternative explanations of the outcomes of particular cases. Again, I'll say a lot more about that down the road. I just want to preview it a little bit here. Some other developments, there's still a range of different ideas and attitudes about case selection strategies. We'll see that not everybody agrees on all these. I would say generally there's emphasis on the positive cases, the cases that are positive on the variable of interest, that have that variable present at maybe a high level, and that are positive on the outcome. So then you can process if there's a link, a causal link or causal explanation between the independent variable and the outcome. We're also interested in deviant cases or outlier cases. These are cases that don't fit the rest of the population or don't fit our expected outcomes. And so we're interested as to why they have a different outcome from other cases in the population, and that might lead us to some new insights or new theories. We're interested in the negative positive cases, the cases that had the outcome of interest but didn't have the variable that we're interested in. And we're interested in the positive negative cases, the cases that had the variable that we're interested in but didn't have the outcome we're interested in. We're not so interested in negative cases, cases that don't have the interesting variables and don't have the outcome. That's lots of cases, and they don't tell us very much. But there are different kinds of comparison, most similar, least similar. We'll talk about those down the road. Typological theorizing, which we'll also discuss, is a way of thinking about whole combinations of variables that form different types of cases, or configurations of variables that form different types of cases, and this is a way of thinking about and addressing interaction effects. We'll also talk a little bit about counterfactual analysis as another kind of comparison, if you will. So there are a lot of new training opportunities in case study and other methods. I teach this course at Georgetown, at GSERM in St. Gallen, at IQMR in Syracuse, at the University of Oslo. You can Google all of those acronyms and you can find out more, not just about my course, but other courses that these institutions offer. For many of them, you can find the syllabi and the reading lists online that will help you in following these videos if you're not doing these videos already in a course together with me. At the American Political Science Association each year, there are a lot of panels on case study and other methods, and there are also what are called short courses where faculty like me teach courses on methods in the early day just before the conference officially starts for most people. In addition, there are programs at the ICPSR at Michigan, at Essex University. These are summer programs. ECPR is another summer program. WSSR at Concordia. I've taught in some of these programs. And you can find out about those programs, again, by just Googling some of those acronyms that I gave you very quickly. Okay, let me turn then from this short history and institutional history to the questions that I want you to discuss, either think about on your own if you're doing this video by yourself or with others, talk about it with others, or if you're doing a course with me to prepare for our discussions and interactions. And that's how do we think about prediction and explanation, and in the next video we'll talk about causal mechanisms. So, basic question, what are theories? What do we want theories to do? People have a lot of different ideas about what a theory is. We want them to be descriptively accurate. We want them to sort of fit some empirical domain or empirical evidence, but at the same time we want them to generalize, to apply to more than just one case, although I will argue that explaining even just one case, even if it doesn't apply anywhere else, is still an increase in our knowledge. We want theories to predict, to anticipate events, because one of the things we want to do is to be able to affect events, to change outcomes in human affairs, to make the world a better place. So we're very interested in that, but prediction is hard. As Yogi Berra said, prediction is hard, especially about the future. In a minute we'll talk about why that's so difficult. And we also know there's always going to be some exceptions, some anomalies, some surprises when we make predictions. We want theories to explain, to show us why the outcome was to be expected. That will help us, hopefully, to get to predictions and to get to manipulating outcomes so that we have better outcomes than if we hadn't been able to explain events. So social scientists are interested in explaining individual cases. Why did World War I happen? Or why did the 2008 economic crash happen? Or why did the coronavirus happen? Or why is it expanded in some countries more than in others? Other social sciences are also interested in explaining individual cases. Evolutionary science explains the evolution of particular species. Geology explains the geologic history of the Earth. Some other sciences don't focus so much on historical explanation, physics, for example. So what I want you to think about, if you're on your own, or discuss with others, either by itself or as a lead into my discussions with you in a class you're taking, is these questions here. If you're taking a class with me, there's an associated Google document where you can write down your responses to these questions. It's best if you think about your own answers first before you look to the Google document and then see other people's answers. Once you see other people's responses, if they're the same as yours, you don't have to write yours in. You can just put in a little up arrow symbol to show that you had the same idea or same reaction, or that you like what they said. So here are the questions I want you to think about, maybe write some notes about. What does it mean for a theory to predict without explaining what's missing from a theory that we expect in an explanation? Can you think of examples of theories that predict without explaining, either from the social sciences or other sciences? What does it mean, conversely, to explain without predicting? And can you think of some examples of when we can explain without predicting? Under what conditions are we likely to be only able to explain outcomes but not predict them? What factors make it hard to predict outcomes, especially in social and political life? And then finally, how do your answers to these questions relate to different methods, experiments, observational statistics, machine learning or artificial intelligence, and case study methods? So think about those. Maybe write down your answers either just for yourself or on a Google document for a class you're taking with me, and then take a break, and then you might go on to the next video.